Well, welcome everyone. Welcome to the Lunch and Learn series. It's great to see you, and well, I can't see you, but welcome anyway. And it's wonderful. My name's Tim Baker, so I'll be working with you throughout the series. I think some of you are familiar with what I do because you've been engaged or enrolled or registered in one of the other webinars or the Lunch and Learn series. So welcome everyone. Look forward to working with you over the next several weeks. Now, just so that you're aware, you will receive an email from me this afternoon, and in that email, you'll get a copy of the slides and you'll get a copy of the recording. So in other words, that's a great opportunity for you to, review anything that I said. You can relax and not have to take copious notes. And the other reason, of course, is that sometimes you may not be able to attend a session. So when you can't attend a session, all you need to do, of course, is just have a look at the recording in your own time. So that's the reason for that. The other thing is that you'll probably notice that there are 6 one-hour sessions. I strongly recommend that you put those into your calendar so that you're aware of it, because it's too easy to let a meeting or some impromptu engagement get in the way. So if you put them in the calendar, they're coming up, and of course, as they come up, it might be a good idea also to put the links for each one in the calendar. Now, what I normally do is I send you a link for the next one only. And so, you can put that link in, and then of course, each email you get from me will give you the link to the next particular topic. The other thing, and the sessions, even though they're an hour, I try to leave about 2 weeks between each session. And the reason for that is pretty straightforward. And that is that if I made it 4 weeks, you might forget what I was talking about. And of course, if I make it a week, you might get sick and tired of seeing me and hearing from me. We find about 2 weeks is ideal. And during that 2 weeks, I want to encourage you to try some things, try some new things. I'm going to set you a little bit of homework, and that's going to be very practical homework. I want you to go away and try and implement whatever it is that you learn, because it's only that way that you'll actually get the most out of the program. Otherwise, nothing really changes as a result of the program. Okay, so I'll just share my screen, which will help to get things moving. And there we go. And I'll just, there we go. Okay, so obviously the first session we're going to talk about today is this whole notion of giving feedback. And you might say, well, why am I starting with this? I think it's one of the critically important things to do as a leader, is to be giving feedback. And my experience is that people don't receive enough feedback in the workplace. When I talk about feedback, of course, I'm talking about both positive feedback and also constructive feedback. And really, both of those are critically important. And part of your homework, as you could probably imagine, is to start being conscious of giving more feedback. And we'll start with the positive feedback as such. People need feedback, basically. They need to know where they stand. Now, sometimes people get misunderstood by that, because they think that because people need feedback and then they give the feedback and the person doesn't like the feedback, they assume that they don't want the feedback. That's not necessarily the case. They still need the feedback, but they may not appreciate whatever the feedback is, but they still need it. And that's not a reason not to give it. And normally that's when you're giving constructive feedback rather than positive feedback. All right, so you can see in front of you now the program. You can see that we've got 6 modules, and I'll just briefly mention each one. I won't go into great detail, but obviously today we're looking at feedback. Next time we meet in 2 weeks, we will look at enhancing your personal influence, and you'll have an opportunity to complete an online diagnostic, which will actually give you the opportunity of looking at your own influencing style, because the argument is you're in the business of influence. And if you know what your preferred style is, you can start to plan towards using other styles, because good influencers will tend to use different approaches depending on the situation that they're in and the person they're working with. In Unit 3, we'll look at optimizing team performance and how might we get that little extra discretionary effort from the people we lead. And I'll talk about that. In Unit 4, getting the best out of people is really looking at some of the sort of reputable motivational theories that are out there and really be able to turn that into a practice as to trying a few different things in order to get that little extra effort from the people that you lead. In Unit 5, we'll do another diagnostic, which won't be online. It'll be a paper version because I haven't quite converted it over yet. I'm still working on that. But ultimately, the idea is to do a little bit of a personality profile. I'm sure you've done these profiles before, but this will give you an opportunity just to sensitize you to the fact that everybody's different. And instead of the golden rule, which is treat people how you want to be treated, I'm going to advocate that you should adopt the platinum rule, and that is treat people how they want to be treated. And you'll tend to get better results that way. And often that's how personality clashes happen, when people are not, they don't understand where the other person's coming from. So hopefully that'll be a fun session to help you sensitize you or re-engage you with that idea that everybody's different. And the last session we're going to do is looking at running effective meetings. Now, I put this in here because we spend our lives in a meeting. You can argue we're in a meeting now. And as soon as I finish this, you'll probably be in another meeting, and it just goes on and on and on. So if we attend a lot of meetings, and many of those meetings as a leader or a manager, you're actually running. But if we're attending a lot of those meetings, we could at least learn to run them more effectively. And I'm sure you can tell me some horror stories of meetings that aren't run very well, and people become disengaged very easily. And the good news for you is if you decide to apply some of the strategies we're going to talk about in Unit 6, you'll find that you'll be miles ahead of other people, and people will notice that you've got this reputation as an excellent person in terms of facilitating meetings. So we'll look at that in Unit 6. So folks, that's where we're going. So let's go straight into Unit 6. Whoops, so Unit 1, I should say. What am I doing here? Yeah, that's the one I wanted. Yep. Now, I want to start with this quote, and it's probably a good place to start. And that is that if annual reviews are the only time that when feedback is given, then that's a problem, because obviously it's only once or even twice a year. But it's certainly better than nothing. And I find that what happens is a lot of leaders save up their feedback for this one event, which we call a performance review. Now, that's not ideal, because obviously if some incident occurred 6 months ago and you're giving feedback on that, whether it's positive or constructive, the person who's sitting there receiving that feedback is probably thinking to themselves, well, if it was that important, you probably would have said something 6 months ago. So it becomes a problem because it loses its impact if it's only given once a year. So I'm going to suggest to you that feedback is moment by moment, situation by situation, day by day, project by project. In other words, it's an ongoing concern that you're constantly giving feedback, and you're giving that, a lot of it would be very informal, but it is around letting people know where they stand. So one of the greatest compliments that one of your team members can give about you and your leadership style is that they know where they stand with you. They know exactly what you expect of them. And that's a positive thing. And whether they choose to meet that expectation, of course, is another matter. But the point is, at least they know. And how do they know? Because you're constantly giving feedback regularly. Now, here are some interesting stats that probably really highlight the need why we're doing this topic today. And these stats, I think, come from Abode, and 60% of employees don't understand their organisational goals. Now, obviously, if people don't understand when they say understand organisational goals, I'm not talking about being able to parrot off the plaque on the wall, which has the vision statement. I'm talking about understanding the direction of where the organisation or business is going. So over half said they don't understand it. 87% of employees aren't engaged in the work they do. Now, I know you've seen surveys like this. Some people say 70, some people say 80. But you'll find that most of the surveys will indicate that over half the people that are in the workforce, regardless of what industry they are in, are disengaged in their work, which is a real concern for you as a leader, because the question then becomes, how do we engage people more so in the work they do? Because obviously a disengaged person is likely not to perform to the highest standard they possibly can. 77% of employees say that their performance would improve with more feedback. Giving feedback increases engagement by 60%. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about that as well. So if you're looking to engage people more in the work that they do, then the best way to do that is to give regular, constant feedback, and engagement levels will go up. And interestingly enough, it's not just positive feedback, it's also constructive feedback. So the flip side's true, that if you don't give feedback, you'll find that people will be disengaged. So 50% of managers fail to hold their team members accountable and have those hard conversations that they need to have. And I'll talk a little bit about that today. And I know they're not easy, these difficult performance conversations. But the reality is, if you don't have them, then nothing improves. What will happen is that behaviour, whatever it might be, will continue. And that person won't magically wake up one morning and change their behaviour. They will actually need you to talk to them and to give them feedback about that. 57% of employees say that they want the critical feedback that helps them improve. So over half the people surveyed actually are saying, we want more constructive feedback. We want more feedback where we're not doing it right. Now, as I said earlier, just because they say that doesn't necessarily mean that when you give them the feedback that they accept it in the vein that you hope. So therefore, there's two separate issues, but basically people do want to know where the line in the sand is. And I think that's the important point. So all of this means, or all of this is adding up to the fact that we need to give our people more feedback. Ultimately, that's the key point here. Now, this is an interesting chart because what it shows you is that I guess that's a sort of a light pale blue color, and then you've got red. Now, blue is good, red's not so good. So blue is engaged and red is disengaged. So if you look at the top bar there, generally speaking, when you give people only strength-based feedback, now strength-based feedback is positive feedback. So if you only ever just gave people positive feedback, of course, when they did it right and doing it genuinely, you'll find that will be a tool of engagement with your team. On the other hand, and this is where it gets interesting, now that probably doesn't surprise you, but on the second bar, if people only ever receive critical feedback, in other words, they don't get any positive feedback at all, but they get critical feedback, then it's likely that they will be reasonably engaged. So there's a strong message there that constructive feedback will actually engage people, as I mentioned earlier. Now, the last bar is the one that's quite important. If you don't give people any feedback, whether it's positive or constructive, then you're likely to end up with people who are disengaged in the work they do. So the message is obvious. We need to give feedback to people. We need to give feedback to people both in terms of what's positive and perhaps what needs to change. Now, if we do that more than we're doing now, it's likely to affect in a positive way the engagement levels of your team members. So that's an important point that I think we need to recognize. Now, just a couple of other points before we move on. All I'm doing here is just setting up the subject or the topic so that you can understand why we're doing this and what the benefits are for you to be able to give more regular feedback. So roughly by a 3-to-1 margin, employees believe that constructive feedback does more to improve performance than positive feedback. So basically, employees are fairly positive about constructive feedback, and they're basically saying they want it. Now, that's important, but the key is, and I should say this up front, is that if you want people to listen to your feedback, they need to feel that they can trust you or they respect you. And the truth is that respect is earned. It's incredibly hard. It's incredibly hard to get, and it requires a degree of authenticity. Now, this whole program, this whole Lunch and Learn program is going to talk to you about the whole notion of authentic leadership. So you'll get all of those skills, but at the end of the day, the reality is this: you can give 2 people in your team exactly the same feedback because they did exactly the same thing. And let's say it's constructive feedback. You will find that it may be that one person doesn't listen to the feedback and the other person does. And you might think, well, why is that? Well, there's obviously a lot of reasons for it, but one of the key reasons could be that one of those team members respects you and the other one doesn't. So obviously the one that respects you is likely to take it on board and do something about it. And the one that doesn't, of course, will probably just dismiss it. So being a respectful and authentic and trustworthy leader is critically important to the impact and effectiveness of the feedback that you give. But the course or the program that we're running, the Lunch and Learn series, will obviously get into that in some detail. Now, I do want to talk about expectations for a moment, and I want you to think about this, and I'd like you just to give a mental response, just try and answer each of these questions. So when you're actually managing the expectations of the people that you lead, let's see how many of these questions you might be able to answer in the positive. Now, the reality is managing expectations is a more complex task than we might think. Let's look at the very first and most fundamental question, and that is, what are your expectations as a leader? Are you absolutely crystal clear of what your expectations are? What's the minimum acceptable standard of performance? Have you worked that out? Is it absolutely clear in your head what it is? Now, obviously, if you aren't clear about that, then you're not going to be managing expectations very consistently because you don't have a clarity around where the line in the sand is. So it's important to get that clear in your own head first and foremost. And I would suspect that most of you would probably have that worked out. The second key question to ask yourself is, then, have I communicated those expectations to my team? Now, you might say, well, I've done it once, or I did it in a team meeting. The reality is that you need to be communicating expectations all the time, more than once. And not only that, it's the way you do it. So you can certainly communicate your expectations in team meetings, and sometimes that's very important and relevant. At other times, you should be communicating those expectations to the individuals in the team at the time, in the right time, at the right place. But it's important to communicate those expectations, otherwise your colleagues are not going to know where the line in the sand is. They're not going to know what your expectations are. It'll be a mystery to them. They'll guess, but they may not know for sure. Now, the third question you want to ask yourself is, do my team members understand my expectations? Now, that might be a difficult one to answer because very rarely would someone say to you, I don't understand what your expectations are. Normally what happens is that people will just nod and walk away confused. So do they actually understand your expectations? And by that, what I mean is, do they understand why you have those expectations? Do they understand the implications of not meeting those expectations? And do they understand the implications of meeting those expectations? Sometimes it's, you need to explain that to people and to do that as well. Now, just because people understand the expectations doesn't actually mean that they accept them, because most people, of course, have got lots and lots of balls in the air at once that they're juggling, and then all of a sudden you come along and you've got another expectation. So for the person receiving that expectation, they may not accept it, or they may think that something else is more important. So in that sense, accepting the expectation is critically important as to whether or not people will meet that expectation. Now, the other thing is, just because people accept your expectation doesn't necessarily mean that they will commit to it. Now, I'm not splitting hairs here, but a lot of us, when we explain our expectations to people, we make an assumption, and it's the false assumption that people will commit to meeting those expectations. Now, let's say, for example, you said to people, could you complete that report by the close of business today? So that's your expectation, to finish a report by the close of business today. Now, often what happens is that's it, and we assume that the person will walk away and commit to that. And then we get bitterly disappointed later when we find that the person has dropped the ball on that expectation. So try this. It's a good question to ask. So you talk to people about getting the report done by the end of the day, and then you look at the person, you say, can I get your commitment to get this report done by the close of business today? Now that's a question, so you're likely to get a nod or a grunt or a yes. Now either of those means that the person has actually confirmed their commitment to you. Now, if they do that, it's more likely that they will meet that expectation and commit to it than had they not made any non-verbal or verbal commitment. Reason being, of course, is that they'll lose face if they don't actually follow through on that. And it's not disrespectful to ask people to commit to those expectations. In fact, it's a very reasonable thing for you to ask. And anyway, what's unreasonable about asking people to commit to achieving a certain expectation? So maybe that's an area that needs some work for you. Number 6 on the list is, do your team members know how they're performing against those expectations? Now that, of course, is about feedback. So have you do you continue to give regular feedback to people so that they understand whether they're meeting the expectation or not? I think that's extremely important. Otherwise, people really don't know. And by giving people feedback on expectations, you're actually underlining the importance of your expectations to people. And the last point here, and I know some of you are working in larger organizations, am I supporting my team members to achieve those expectations? And what I mean by that is that organizations, particularly large ones, have lots and lots of roadblocks that can get in the way of people meeting expectations. Now, if that's the case, then your job, of course, is to do what you can to try to clear those roadblocks. Now, if you can clear those roadblocks, then of course you're making it easier for your team members to meet those expectations. So for example, that might require you to talk to someone in another team and to try and get a commitment from their manager that so-and-so will give you the information that you need in order to write that report. Whereas in the past, they've probably not met those deadlines. So your manager can do that for you. And so that would be something that you would do in order to pave the way for people to meet those expectations. So you can see it's quite complex, and it's very important to understand that you need to be able to tick all those boxes in order to be managing expectations to a high degree. So have a think about those things, and where might you need to do a little bit more work to build that up. So I want to change tack now, and I really want to now talk about some principles of giving good feedback. And these principles apply whether it's constructive feedback or positive feedback. So regardless of what the feedback is, these are some principles that are pretty important in terms of giving feedback. Firstly, I think it's very important to be giving feedback as quickly after an event as possible. So as I said earlier, if you save it all up for the dreaded performance review, then people will probably think that it wasn't all that important. Otherwise, you would have mentioned it 6 months ago. So timing is critical. The faster you give people feedback after the event, and when I say the event, that's where the behaviour, required you to give the feedback. The quicker you can do that after the behaviour that you've observed, the quicker you can do that, the more likely it is that the person will respect the feedback. Now, why is that? Well, the truth of the matter is, if you give feedback to people after the event or as soon after the event as possible, they will make the correct assumption that it is important because you have made it a priority. In other words, you've done that rather than doing something else. Now, we're all busy people, and what it basically means is that you've got to jump on things as quickly as you can. And I'm not talking just about constructive feedback here, I'm talking about positive feedback. So for example, if somebody presented in the meeting this morning and did a wonderful job, if you pulled them up after the meeting and praised them for the wonderful job they did, then it's going to be far more impactful than if you left it till next week, because of course it's immediate. The timing is right. You have obviously made it clear to the other person that it's very, very important. Now, specific feedback is critically important, not just generalizations. So sometimes you have to actually think about the words that you're going to use in order to give the feedback that you require. And if you don't do this, sometimes people will accuse you of being too personal in your feedback. Sometimes they'll accuse you of that anyway, but being specific in your feedback is critically important. Let's have a look at an example. Now, let's assume that you gave somebody this feedback this morning. Let's say that you said to them, overall, good job on the presentation of this morning's meeting, but could have been better. Now, if you said that to somebody, what do you think they might think? And of course, the answer is they're going to think, well, what went wrong? What could have been better? Why didn't my manager like my presentation? What could he or she mean? So in other words, and sometimes they might not ask you because they're blindsided by that. They'll go away and think about it. So that feedback is not specific. All right. And therefore, all it's done is actually made the person, that is the team member, more confused about their presentation. So what about this as an example? It's not the only way you could have given this feedback, but what about if you said this? Great job at the presentation. I really liked how you used statistics to back up your key points. One small comment, maybe for next time, you could invite more comments in the group and get them more involved. See how that works? So in other words, if I'm on the receiving end of that, I'm crystal clear about what you liked about the presentation, the very fact that I used statistics to back up my case. So I'm aware of that. I'm not just making generalization about good job on the presentation, but I've also added a constructive thought that you might like to consider down the track. And that is, of course, getting other people involved in your presentation. Now, a lot of times, if you do it specifically, what will happen is that person on the receiving end is more likely to accept the feedback and may even say to you, yes, you're right, I was nervous, I probably should have, I wish I had have engaged people more by asking questions. So your feedback's going to be more effective if it's specific. Now, what that means, of course, is sometimes you have to think before you open your mouth. You have to actually consider how much you frame that feedback, particularly if it's constructive feedback. So that's the second principle. So we've got timing and we've got being specific. The third principle, and I've touched on this several times so far, is that it needs to be frequent. So moment by moment, project by project, situation by situation, It should be ongoing and never ending, and it should happen daily and weekly. And so therefore, when it gets to performance appraisal time, it should really be a formality. People are absolutely clear about the areas that they can improve and the areas where you're particularly happy. So frequency is critically important. Otherwise, people aren't used to your feedback. That's the other side of it. So if they're not used to your feedback, it's hard for them to actually digest it, regardless of whether it's positive or constructive. So the big key point I want you to get out of today's session is that you need to be doing it on a more consistent and frequent period of time. So of course, we've got some homework for you in that regard. So let's sum up. Timeliness is very important. Being specific is very important. And being frequent in the feedback that you give is very important as well. Now, the other thing about feedback is it shouldn't be a one-way affair. So it's not all about you, launching into a monologue. So the idea is, and it's often a very good idea, is to ask people for their own feedback. So if we go back to the previous example about the person's presentation in the team meeting, what's to stop us asking the person how they thought the presentation went first? What's to stop us doing that? In fact, it's a very good starting point. And that person may well say exactly what you were going to say anyway. Now, if that's the case, then all you need to do is to confirm it. But on the other hand, if they say something that's slightly different to what you thought, then you can say, look, I've got another suggestion for you, or are you open to a little bit more feedback? And you could talk about perhaps getting people more engaged in the presentation. So getting in the business of asking questions is critically important. And I often say that leaders are in the business of asking questions, not answering questions. So have a think about that. The mindset is, as a leader, that we should be in the business of asking, not answering. Because if you only answer questions, then what happens if it's a silly question? Moreover, what happens if you want to get them to think? The only way you can get people to think, of course, is to ask thoughtful questions, and people will have to ponder the answer on those questions. Now, the other issue that's very important, particularly for constructive feedback, is to do it in private. There is an adage that suggests that praise in public and criticize in private. I'd be very wary of that, because I think the truth of the matter is some of the people that you lead are probably quite introvert. Now, if they are introvert, they may feel embarrassed about receiving public praise. You might feel good about it. Maybe everyone else in the team feels good about it, but just be aware that the person on the receiving end might just feel a little awkward in those circumstances. And I often err on the side of privacy when I'm giving feedback. So in other words, I try and give both constructive and positive feedback in private, because you can be assured that it's just as, if not more effective, done in private than it is in public. So don't feel as if you have to single people out, in a team meeting, because if you do that, the person who is the receiver of that feedback sometimes can feel a little awkward. So it's just something to think about. In that case, to save me from having that happen, it might just be best for me to talk to that person privately and just to praise them in a positive way. Now, of course, when you give feedback to people, you need to base it on something, because if you just give people generalized feedback, they're going to be sort of scratching their head and wondering when it applies. So what I suggest you do is you use what we might call a critical incident. In other words, in most cases, so for example, if somebody's talking to another person and say a ratepayer, or maybe somebody's talking to a customer and they're being a bit short, or maybe a little aggressive, then that's a critical incident. And of course, if you see that and hear it, then you can pull that person up after and talk to them about it. That would be the critical incident. So try to base your feedback. Now, sometimes that's not always possible because you sometimes hear things third hand. So in other words, you weren't in the room, you didn't actually see what was going on. Now, if that's the case, then the best course of action is to have a conversation with the other person, that is the person you're giving the feedback to, and ask them what happened. And then perhaps you might say, well, what went well in that what went well in that incident, and what perhaps would you have done differently if you'd had the opportunity to do it again? That's the sort of thing that will be more effective than just trying to guess what happened, because often that's a dangerous thing to do. Now, remember, any feedback that you give is all about the future. Now, this is important because I think sometimes we spend a lot of time wallowing around in the past. The past is useful to find out what, what actually happened, but we really shouldn't be indulging too much in the past, because there's only two particular reasons that you're giving feedback to someone. And both of those reasons are to do with the future. The first reason that you're giving someone feedback is so that you can reinforce that behavior and to make sure that the person continues to behave in that way. So obviously something that's quite positive, you want them to continue that behavior. So therefore it's to reinforce. So positive feedback is about reinforcing that behavior in future situations. Now, if it's constructive feedback, it may well be that what you're doing is that you're trying to get the person to remedy that behavior for the future. In other words, not to repeat it. And by giving that feedback, you're probably doing that to try to prevent that behavior from occurring again. So you can see that feedback is really all about the future. And so it's really, really important for you to focus on the future. So now let's talk about some of the more difficult feedback situations that you might be in. And let's just talk about a few tips that might help you with this. This is particularly the case when you're talking about performance and when you're talking about perhaps poor performance, and you have to actually sit down with people and give them feedback about that poor performance. Now, I'm not suggesting for a minute that this is easy, but I do think it's essential that we try a few things, and I just want to give you a few things to think about here. The first thing is some people will want to argue with you when you're giving them constructive feedback. They'll want to argue, or they'll want to defend themselves, or whatever. The important thing for you is not to engage in that. So the important thing for you is not to get into an argument with the other person. So how do you do that? Well, there are two techniques that are really useful. One technique is to actually say to the other person, I refuse to argue with you about this. Now, if you say to someone, I refuse to argue with you about this, then you've just disengaged the argument, because obviously if you're not going to argue back, it is a pointless exercise for them to continue to pursue their line of attack. Now, the other thing you could say to someone is, if it's a smallish thing where there's a disagreement, you could say to the other person, let's agree to disagree. So in other words, what you're saying to the other person is, let's agree to disagree. In other words, let's just leave it and let's move on to the next thing. Two techniques that will help there. Remember that the whole purpose of feedback in the workplace, as distinct from feedback to your children or your partner or anything else, feedback in the workplace is all about performance, either reinforcing good performance or rectifying poor performance. So ultimately, it's not about the individual and it's not about a personal attack. It's really about the performance. And that's why it's very important to use critical incidents to help you to frame your feedback so that people understand you're talking about an incident or maybe a couple of incidents, but people know what you're referring to. Focus on the future. In other words, don't spend too much time talking about the past, except to understand the implications of what actually happened, but try to steer the conversation towards the future, because ultimately that's what this is all about. It's all about continuing this behavior or changing this behavior for the future. Fourthly, emphasize strengths as well as weaknesses. I think it's important to let people know that you have confidence in their ability to be able to make the necessary changes that you suggest they should. So, for example, you might end the conversation by saying, "Look, I've got every confidence that you'll be able to make the changes needed," or "I've got every confidence the next time you're going to be put in that difficult position with a customer that you won't, you won't react the way you did." So that is important, because otherwise the person may not think that you've got confidence in their ability to change. So that would be something I strongly recommend that you do. And finally, I think it's really important on complex situations is not to jump to assumptions and think that you know what went on. I think sometimes that's why it's important to ask some open-ended questions at the beginning, why, what, when, who, where, how, and which. And what those questions do is to seek out the causes. Sometimes it's a good idea to use the closed question, "Do you mind if I ask you some questions so that I understand what happened?" That's a good question. And 99.9% of the time, the person's going to say, "Go, yeah, sure, no problem." And then you can ask a series of questions and not feel as if you're playing detective. And you can find out a little bit more about what actually happened, so that you've got a more rounded view of the circumstances that they were in. So those things help a lot. So don't just jump to assumptions. I guess that's the point. Now, a few other things that are important when you're dealing with poor performance and making sure that the feedback that you give on poor performance does hit the mark. A few things. Now, if you have to give somebody feedback about their performance, and let's talk about poor performance, and you call that person away for a meeting, so let's say you've booked a meeting room and you decide to go in the meeting room, and when you sit down in that meeting room, of course, there's a bit of tension in the air, because the other person knows that this is probably not going to be a pleasant conversation. And so there's tension there already. Now, if you try and diffuse that attention with small talk, it's not going to go very well. All that's going to happen is it'll create more and more tension. Now, it's fine if you're talking to a customer to have a bit of small talk, but in these sorts of conversations, you need to get straight to the point. Why? Because the person's sitting there thinking, "When are you going to tell me why I'm here?" And what happens is the longer you leave it, the greater the tension rises in the room. So all you're doing is actually making it worse. So get straight to the point. And by getting straight to the point, what I suggest you do is you explain the purpose of the meeting. So use the critical incident and explain the purpose of the meeting up front. And this is very, very important, because people need to know why they've been called into this meeting room to talk to you about their performance. So if you give them the purpose of the meeting up front, then at least the person's aware of why they're there. And of course, from that point, you can move on. Now, as soon as possible in this conversation, notice the word I'm using, conversation. As soon as possible, encourage the other person to speak. In other words, encourage them to give their perspective on the situation. Now, there's two good reasons for that. One is it gives you a chance to start to think and formulate your own ideas about where to take this conversation. And secondly, by doing that, you're engaging in a two-way dialogue rather than a monologue. You actually want the other person engaged in the conversation, not just sitting there passively while you sort of read them the riot act. So encourage them to talk. And the way to do that is to ask them a question. What's your perception of what happened? And then sit back in your chair and don't interrupt them and give them a chance to say their bit. Now, this is the other important point, is a fundamental, is that when they're talking, it's really important for you not to interrupt them. Now, that's easier said than done, because sometimes people will say things that are inaccurate. Sometimes people will say things to make you bite. It is extremely important that you just don't interrupt them. Let them speak. Bite your tongue until it bleeds, as they say. Don't interrupt. Now, once they've finished saying what they're going to say and they're ready to, they're drawing breath, your job then is to say to them, look, there's a couple of things that you said I'd like to respond to in what you just said. So you can now address those matters, but only after they've finished saying what they were going to say. Now, why would you want to do that? Well, it's called respect. It is also means it gives you the moral authority that when you're speaking and somebody, maybe the other person, interrupts you, you're in a strong position to say, now just a moment, I gave you a chance. Can you just hear me out before, and just, so you can do that. And you can do that with great legitimacy, provided, of course, you've done it yourself. So there's some fundamentals in terms of, meeting people who, their performance is not up to scratch, and you really need to give them feedback on it. So there's some things to think about. All right, so folks, I've got some homework for you, and what I'd like you to do, and it's not onerous, and you'll find it's reasonably pleasant and very interesting. Here it is. I want you to give positive feedback 3 times a day for a week. Now, it's Friday afternoon. I want you to, not quite Friday afternoon, in Queensland at least, but I want you to find 3 opportunities this afternoon to give positive feedback. Now you might say, well, that's a lot. Well, look for 3 things that are going right. I'm sure you'll find them if you look carefully enough. And then when you've found them, I want you to actually acknowledge it by saying it to the person involved. All right, using the principles we've talked about today. Now, then I want you to find another person. And then I want you to find a 3rd person. And then I want you to go home tonight on the weekend having given 3 bits of positive feedback this afternoon. Now, next week on Monday, if you're in the office on Monday, I want you to give 3 bits of positive feedback again. I want you to do the same on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. And you will be very pleasantly surprised at what it does to engagement levels in the office. Now, it doesn't have to be a half an hour each. It can be something that's done in a corridor. It can be done very informally. I don't want you to do it via email if you can help it. What would be better if it's face-to-face? I realize sometimes it can't be done, but I'd like you to do this. You'll be very surprised at what it does. Now, the first time you do this, you might get some very, very strange looks. And you might say, I wonder why I'm getting these strange looks. Well, it might be because they're probably not used to you giving positive feedback. And if they're not used to you giving positive feedback, then it explains why they're giving you a funny look. So just thank people. Thank you is a very good way of giving feedback. Just thank people, and that in itself is feedback. So that's your homework. It's not onerous, but it's something that I want you to be mindful of. So watch yourself and give yourself the opportunity to do that. Folks, we've got time for a couple of questions. Does anyone have anything that they'd like to ask me? Because you can go to the question box up the top there. You can type in your question and I'll see it, and I'm more than happy to respond to it if necessary. Okay, nothing really? Okay, well, I'm assuming that that you got something useful out of the session, and I'm hoping, of course, that you will take away with you 3 positives every single day. And look, the point I'm making there is that you're actually getting used to giving feedback. So that's the point. All right, so thank you, folks. Next time we meet, which of course is in a fortnight. We'll look at enhancing your personal influence. And what I'd like you to do is you'll get a link to complete a diagnostic. So you'll get an email from me this afternoon, which will have the slides, it'll have the recording of today, and it'll have a link to the diagnostic and for the next particular Lunch and Learn series unit. Complete that, you'll find it very interesting. You can print it out straight away, the report. It's about 14 pages and it talks about your influencing style, because that's what we're going to look at in a couple of weeks' time. So thanks, folks. We're pretty much done. We'll catch up in a fortnight. Thank you. Have a wonderful weekend. And don't forget, this afternoon, I want you to give 3 bits of positive feedback. Thanks, everyone. Have a fantastic weekend. Catch you in 2 weeks' time. Thank you and goodbye.